Welcome back to Ben's Book Club. Today we are diving into the book Why Nations Fail: The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. MIT economist Darren Acemoglu and Harvard political scientist James Robinson literally spent 15 years developing the thesis of this book. They drew on case studies from, well, pretty much every continent and era of human history. It's a sweeping, deeply fascinating argument that attempts to answer one of the absolute oldest questions in human history. Why do some nations thrive in unimaginable wealth, while others are just trapped in these endless cycles of poverty?
Okay, let's dive right into this by looking at a totally fascinating mystery right on the US-Mexico border. Imagine this. If you walked just a mile south from a coffee shop in Nogales, Arizona, you'd cross directly into Nogales, Sonora. Now, on the Arizona side, you're going to find a high-income, relatively safe community with widespread access to healthcare and education. But walk just across the fence into Sonora, and you're looking at a city with a third of the income, significantly lower life expectancy, and really struggling public services. Here is the paradox, right? These two halves of the exact same city share the identical geography, the exact same climate, and historically, the exact same culture and ancestry. So how on earth can two halves of an identical environment have wildly different levels of wealth? Well, the authors argue the only real difference is that border fence, and more importantly, the invisible rules operating on either side of it.
To solve this Nogales paradox, Acemoglu and Robinson systematically dismantle the old, tired excuses for national poverty. For decades, popular theories just blame geography, basically arguing that tropical diseases or landlocked terrains doomed certain countries to poverty. But look at countries like Botswana. They absolutely thrived despite having supposedly terrible landlocked geography. The authors also reject the culture hypothesis. For instance, some scholars used to claim that specific religions or work ethics were essentially required for capitalism to work. Yet South Korea prospered immensely under the exact same cultural background as its struggling northern neighbor. Finally, they debunk the ignorance hypothesis. It's not that leaders simply don't know the right economic policies. Trust me, they know. But as we'll see in a minute, their incentives are just entirely different.
So the core thesis really comes down to this. A nation's prosperity isn't dictated by natural luck, the weather, or random historical accidents. No, it is driven entirely by man-made rules, laws, and systems, what the authors call institutions, that its leaders deliberately choose to build and maintain. Prosperity, as we are going to explore throughout this explainer, is essentially a political choice. This brings us to the first of two absolutely crucial concepts that anchor this entire framework: inclusive institutions. Think of these as systems that fundamentally level the playing field. When a nation actually has inclusive economic institutions, it means there are secure property rights, unbiased courts, and an open market where literally anyone can participate. Think about it for a second. If you invent a revolutionary new app, you know the courts will protect your patent and you actually get to keep the rewards. That guarantee is exactly what motivates you to work hard, invest, educate yourself, and innovate in the first place.
On the flip side, we have extractive institutions. Just as the name implies, these systems are practically designed to, well, extract resources, wealth, and labor from the vast majority of the population. And this isn't just bad policy. It's a deliberate, intentional design to funnel wealth upwards to enrich a very narrow, very powerful elite at the top. Under extractive systems, property rights are weak or totally non-existent for the average person. The elites basically use their unchecked power to stifle competition, create monopolies, and essentially drain the nation's wealth to keep themselves very comfortable, all while the broader society just stagnates. And the divergence on the Korean peninsula brilliantly illustrates this framework in action. Back in 1945, at the end of World War II, the region was divided. Both sides started with an identical baseline. Same culture, same geography, same history, but they adopted wildly different institutions. South Korea embraced inclusive economic systems, rewarding innovation and broad participation, and today, it literally feeds the world with its technology and culture. North Korea, however, adopted fiercely extractive institutions, concentrating all power right at the top. Tragically, today, its regime cannot even feed its own citizens. If you've ever seen that famous satellite image of the peninsula at night, you know the one, South Korea is glowing with light and North Korea is in pitch black, you've seen this exact divergence playing out in real time.
Now, this brings us to the real engine of capitalism: creative destruction. New, better technologies naturally replace the old ones. Inclusive systems absolutely love this. They embrace disruptive ideas because society as a whole benefits. But extractive elites, they are absolutely terrified of creative destruction. Why? Because economic disruption inevitably leads to political disruption.
A great historical example of this is the Ottoman Empire, which banned the printing press for centuries. The elites weren't afraid of the machine itself, obviously. They were afraid that mass communication would make the population way too hard to control. So they just blocked innovation entirely to keep their iron grip on power. But honestly, this raises a huge question. If extractive elites are so good at holding on to power, how do institutions ever actually change? Well, according to the authors, they shift during what are called critical junctures. These are massive, landscape-altering historical shocks. We're talking a global pandemic, a major war, or the discovery of a completely new continent. These shocks scramble the existing power structures and totally rewrite the rules of the game, ultimately pushing a society down a brand new path toward either inclusion or extraction. Let's look at a classic example to see how this plays out. When the Black Death hit Europe in 1346, it wiped out nearly half the population. This created a sudden, massive labor shortage, a true critical juncture. In Western Europe, workers realized they suddenly had leverage. They used this crisis to demand more inclusive freedoms, which effectively ended serfdom. But over in Eastern Europe, the existing elites were just a little bit more organized. They used the exact same crisis to double down, violently crushing peasant uprisings and enforcing a heavily extractive second serfdom. So you have one massive shock, but two completely different institutional trajectories. That early, slightly more inclusive path in Western Europe eventually led to another major critical juncture, England's Glorious Revolution in 1688. This was a monumental turning point where the English Parliament successfully wrestled unchecked power away from the king. Because power was suddenly being shared more broadly, Parliament passed laws securing property rights for everyday inventors and merchants. And, it is absolutely no coincidence that the Industrial Revolution flourished in England shortly after. Innovators finally knew for sure that the king couldn't just arbitrarily steal their machines or their profits. Once inclusive institutions are planted, they actually tend to protect themselves. This creates what's called a virtuous circle. It's this incredibly powerful feedback loop where broad power sharing leads to fair laws. Fair laws generate widespread wealth, and as more people become wealthy and educated, society as a whole becomes incredibly resistant to giving up its power. It makes it extremely hard for any single dictator to ever take over again. Basically, success fundamentally breeds more success. Tragically, extractive systems create the exact opposite, a vicious circle. When the state is essentially set up as a giant machine to extract wealth for the elites, the prize for controlling that state becomes irresistibly huge. This leads to what the authors call the iron law of oligarchy. And this brings a real tragic irony to many post-colonial reformers, especially in parts of Africa and Latin America. They fought bravely for freedom to overthrow extractive colonial regimes, only to fall victim to the vicious circle. Once they took power, the temptation of that extraction machine was just too great, and they simply became the new thieves in charge, repeating the endless cycles of repression. Now, as you're watching this explainer, you might be wondering about authoritarian regimes that actually seem to boom economically. How does that fit in? Well, extractive systems can absolutely force rapid, short-term growth. The Soviet Union is a perfect example of this. By moving millions of peasants into factories by pure brute force, their GDP skyrocketed for a few decades. But because extractive systems naturally suppress creative destruction and genuine innovation, that brute force growth always hits a wall. Without new ideas, the economy eventually stalls, and as we saw with the Soviet Union, it inevitably collapses. This framework leads us to one of the most fascinating geopolitical questions today, specifically regarding China's current model. Over the last few decades, China has experienced unprecedented economic growth by adopting more inclusive economic policies, yet it firmly maintains highly extractive, centralized political institutions. So the crucial question is, can an extractive political system sustain an inclusive economy long-term? Or will the fear of creative destruction eventually cause them to hit that exact same Soviet-style wall? It's a debate that economists are watching incredibly closely right now. The authors also issue a stark, completely impartial warning for historically inclusive places like the US and the UK. The virtuous circle is strong, sure, but it is inherently fragile. It really prompts us to constantly examine our own systems impartially and ask, are modern issues like massive corporate lobbying, rent-seeking behavior, and growing inequality early signs of democratic backsliding? When rules are rewritten to favor specific wealthy groups over the general public, it's a hallmark sign that a society might be quietly slipping backward toward an extractive system. Ultimately, the most empowering takeaway from this entire analysis is that poverty and prosperity are not predetermined destinies. A nation isn't doomed by its geography, nor is it guaranteed success by its history. As history consistently shows us, institutions are man-made. The rules can be rewritten. Now, it is incredibly difficult to break those vicious circles, but understanding the root cause is the very first step. Prosperity is a political choice that societies must actively make and protect.
I really hope this deep dive gave you a new lens to view the world and helped you understand the profound impact that our invisible systems and rules have on global wealth and inequality. It leaves us with one final, pretty heavy question to ask ourselves. Are the institutions we rely on every single day building a virtuous circle for our future, or are we quietly slipping into a vicious one? Subscribe so you don't miss an episode.